The crystal stem of Nelly's wine glass snapped between her fingers the moment the tasting room doors slammed open, letting in a blast of dry Napa heat and the one man she had spent the last couple of months trying to erase from her life. Julian didn't belong here, not in a private rehearsal, not among the curated calm of oak barrels and soft jazz, not in a room full of people who had never learned to fear the sound of his footsteps. But he walked in like he owned the vineyard, the valley, and every breath Nelly took. "Nelly," he hissed, crossing the floor with a predator's certainty. "You didn't answer your phone." She froze. Her pulse stuttered. The glass stem dug into her palm, but she barely felt it. Julian's hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers digging into the same spot they always had. "We're leaving. Now." The best man, sweet, nervous, painfully polite, stepped forward with a shaky, "Hey man, maybe you should." Julian turned his head. One look. One sharp, vicious smile. The best man backed away so fast he nearly tripped over a wine barrel. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Guests looked down at their shoes. Someone cleared their throat. No one knew how to step in without making it worse. Except one man. Eugene had been leaning against the far wall, half listening to a sommelier drone about notes of plum and leather, bored enough to consider leaving early. He didn't do weddings. He didn't do crowds. He was only here because the groom was one of the few people in the world he still owed anything to. But the moment Julian's hand tightened and Nelly flinched, not dramatically, not loudly, just a small sharp intake of breath, Eugene's boredom evaporated. His head lifted. His eyes sharpened. The room shifted around him. He set his wine glass down with a soft, deliberate click. Julian didn't notice. Nelly did. A shadow moved across the polished floorboards, slow and unhurried, like a wolf stepping out of the tree line. Eugene stopped beside them, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. "You're holding her too tightly," he said, tone almost conversational. Julian blinked, thrown off by the calm. "This is none of your business." Eugene's gaze flicked to Julian's hand on Nelly's arm, then back to Julian's face. "It is now." Something in his voice, the quiet, the certainty, the absolute lack of fear, made the air in the room thicken. Julian opened his mouth to argue. He never got the chance. Two men in tailored black appeared behind him, silent as shadows. Julian stiffened as they took him by the arms, lifting him off the ground with a smoothness that suggested long practice. Hey, put me down. Nelly, tell them." She didn't speak. She couldn't. Eugene didn't look at Julian again. He didn't need to. His men carried the struggling ex-fiancé out the service entrance, the door swinging shut behind them with a soft, final thud. Silence fell. Eugene turned to Nelly. "You're safe," he said quietly. Not a question. Not a reassurance. A fact. Nelly swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. Eugene's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something far more dangerous. "A friend of the groom," he said. "And now it seems yours." The room didn't surge forward afterward. That was the first thing Nelly noticed once Julian was gone. Conversation resumed in fragments, too loud, too fast. Someone laughed a beat late. A server hurried to refill glasses as if wine could smooth over what had just happened. The oak and plum jazz drifted back in, polite and useless. Nelly stood exactly where Julian had left her, pulse hammering, fingers still clenched around the broken stem of her glass. Blood welled slowly in her palm. She barely felt it. A woman brushed past her shoulder. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, eyes flicking everywhere but Nelly's face. "Yes," Nelly said automatically. The lie tasted familiar. She wrapped her napkin around her hand, breathing through the tremor still working its way through her body. Fear lingered, but it hadn't won. What unsettled her more was the after. The quiet. The way the room had chosen comfort over intervention. Except for him. She turned. The man who had intervened hadn't moved far. He stood near the tasting bar now, one broad shoulder resting against reclaimed wood, fingers loosely curled around a wine glass he hadn't finished. He looked unimpressed. Not shaken. Not amped. Bored. Up close, he was worse, or better, than she'd thought. Tall. Solid. Dressed in black like it belonged to him. Not handsome in a comforting way, sharp, deliberate, the kind of face you noticed because it didn't ask permission. His presence bent the space subtly, the way deep water pulls without splashing. Their eyes met. Something in his gaze sharpened, as if he'd just noticed the cut on her hand. "Sit," he said quietly. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a question. It was practical. She found herself obeying, lowering into the nearest chair as he stepped closer. He took the napkin from her fingers without asking, examined the shallow slice, then motioned for a server with a look that brooked no delay. "Bandage," he said. The server nodded too quickly and disappeared. Nelly studied him while he worked, the calm efficiency, the complete absence of apology or explanation. This was not a man who checked in after acting. This was a man who acted because he'd already decided. "Thank you," she said finally. He glanced at her. "You don't need to thank me." That unsettled her more than anything else. Across the room, a sommelier resumed his soft monologue about tannins and leather notes, voice shaking slightly as if he were trying to convince himself the night was still under control. The man beside her didn't listen. Song Doo-jin noticed, distantly, how bad the wine still was. Too much oak. Overworked. Trying to impress people who didn't know the difference. He hadn't planned to stay long. Civilian weddings were like this. Pretty on the surface. Exhausting underneath. He was only here because the groom had once dragged him out of a soul alley with blood on his hands and a broken bottle at his feet. Debts like that didn't expire. Doo-jin had been calculating his exit when the sound cut through the room, a sharp, wrong intake of breath. That was when he'd looked up. Now, watching Nelly steady herself, fury banked but unbroken, his interest sharpened into something precise. Not because she was fragile. Because she wasn't. "You handled that better than most," he said. She let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "That's not a compliment I ever wanted." His mouth curved faintly, not a smile. Recognition. The server returned with a bandage. Doo-jin wrapped her hand with care that surprised her, firm, exact, respectful. When he finished, his fingers lingered for half a second longer than necessary. "You shouldn't have to disappear to feel safe." She met his eyes. Neither should anyone else. Something about that pleased him. The groom appeared moments later, pale and flustered, apology tumbling out in pieces. Doo-jin dismissed it with a glance. The issue was already handled. What mattered now stood in front of him. "I'm Song Doo-jin," he said. The name still meant nothing to her. The way the room subtly shifted when others overheard it did. "I'm Nelly," she replied. "I know." That should have frightened her. Instead, it grounded her. As the vineyard lights glowed warmer and the night closed ranks around the celebration, Nelly felt it, the quiet sense that something had been set in motion that wouldn't stop simply because the music had started again. And Doo-jin, watching her with measured intent, already knew. He wasn't leaving Napa when the wedding ended. Nelly didn't see Julian again that night. She kept expecting him to reappear at the edge of her vision, angry, loud, familiar in the worst way, but the vineyard remained sealed and serene, as if he'd been edited out of the evening entirely. It was unsettling. Julian had never been subtle. His absence felt deliberate. Song Doo-jin stayed. Not beside her. Not hovering. Just present. He spoke briefly with the groom, a low exchange near the bar that ended with a relieved exhale and a hand clasped over Doo-jin's forearm. After that, people seemed to instinctively give him space. Conversations bent around him. Servers checked with him before making decisions that weren't his to make. Nelly noticed everything. She also noticed that when she drifted toward the terrace for air, he repositioned without looking like he had, never blocking her, never crowding her, just ensuring the shadows weren't empty. It should have made her nervous. Instead, for the first time since Julian walked in, she could breathe. "Are you leaving?" he asked when she returned inside, voice pitched low enough to feel private in a room full of people. "Not yet," she said. "I'm supposed to help with seating charts. Apparently that's my honor." His gaze flicked to the clipboard in her hand. "You're doing too much." She huffed a soft laugh. "That's been said before." He watched her for a beat, as if filing that away. "Come." She blinked. "Come where?" "Outside," he said. 5 minutes. It wasn't an order. He waited. Nelly hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes felt reasonable. Necessary. They stepped onto the terrace, the night air cooler, scented with crushed grapes and earth. Rows of vines stretched out under soft uplighting, the valley hushed and golden. The music faded to a murmur behind them. Eugene leaned against the stone balustrade, eyes scanning the perimeter once before settling back on her. "Tell me his name," he said. "Julian. And he's not invited." "No." "Good." A pause. "He won't be back." She studied his face, looking for bravado. Found none. Just certainty. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. He inclined his head, accepting it now that the adrenaline had passed. "You shouldn't have had to handle that alone." "I usually do," she replied. "People like to pretend they didn't see." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "I don't." The weight of that settled between them, not romantic, yet, but grounding. Nelly hugged herself lightly against the chill. "You hate weddings," she said, more observation than question. "Yes." "Wine tastings too?" "Especially wine tastings." That drew a smile from her, quick and surprised. "You're at the wrong wedding then." "I was," he said, "before." She met his gaze. The silence stretched, comfortable in a way that felt earned rather than accidental. Inside, someone laughed loudly. A glass clinked. Life went on. "I should go back," she said finally. He nodded. "I'll walk you." He did, stopping a respectful distance from the doors. When she turned to thank him again, she found him already stepping back, giving her the choice without comment. "Song Eugene," she said, testing his name again. "You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied. "And what's that?" "That you didn't break," he said simply. "That matters." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to notice that. As she rejoined the party, Nelly felt something shift, not relief, not safety exactly, but a quiet recalibration. The night no longer felt like something happening to her. Across the room, Eugene watched her resume her place among friends, clipboard in hand, spine straight. The vineyard lights cast her in gold. He found, to his irritation, that leaving now felt impossible. Civilian weddings were exhausting. But some vintages, he knew, were worth lingering over. And as the music swelled and the rehearsal dinner rolled toward its end, Song Eugene made a decision he rarely allowed himself. He would stay in Napa for the week. Not for the groom. Not for the wine. For Nelly Turner. Nelly woke the next morning the way she always did after something bad happened, too alert, too quiet inside her own skin. For a few seconds, she lay still and listened. No footsteps outside her door. No voice in the hallway. No sharp knock that made her stomach flip. Just birds, distant delivery trucks, and the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning. Normal. She sat up anyway, palm pressed to her chest as if she could slow her heart by force. The bandage on her hand was neatly wrapped, the kind of careful that felt deliberate. She stared at it until memory caught up. Julian. The doors slamming open. Fingers on her arm. The way the room had looked away. People frozen, unsure, afraid of escalating it. And the way one man hadn't. She showered too hot, dressed too carefully, and told herself she was fine, because she had a schedule. Because wedding weeks didn't pause for panic. Because her friend deserved better than Nelly dragging darkness through someone else's joy. She made it downstairs for the morning run-through with a smile practiced into place. The estate was even prettier in daylight. Sunlight over vine rows like brushed gold. White tents being raised on the lawn. Staff moving with quiet competence. The air smelled like citrus blossoms and damp soil. And Song Eugene was already there. Not in the center. Not circulating like a guest. Near the edge, where he could see everything. He wore black again, of course he did, but in the sun it looked less like mourning and more like a declaration. He stood with his hands in his pockets, expression unreadable, as if the morning itself was something he didn't trust. Nelly's steps slowed before she could stop them. He turned his head slightly, gaze locking on her with the same calm precision as the night before. No surprise. Like he'd expected her. "Good morning," she said, because polite was easier than honest. "Morning," he replied. A pause. His eyes flicked to her hand. "It's healing." It wasn't a question. He'd already checked. I didn't even feel it until later, she admitted, then hated that she'd said it. His gaze didn't soften, but something in his attention sharpened, like her words gave him information he didn't like. You're used to pain, he said quietly. Nelly lifted her chin. I'm used to keeping things moving. Dujin held her gaze for a beat, then nodded once, as if he respected the choice even if he didn't approve of the cost. You're on schedule, he said. She blinked. What? The bridal party is meeting in the tasting room. 10 minutes. His eyes drifted past her, scanning the estate with lazy focus. You don't have time to stand here and pretend you're not tired. Nelly almost laughed. Are you telling me what to do? I'm telling you the truth, he said. Do what you want with it. There it was again. Not control. Not pressure. Just a blunt clarity that made her feel seen in a way that was inconvenient. She started walking again, forcing herself not to look back. She failed. Dujin followed at a distance that never felt invasive and never felt accidental. The week unfolded in bright, expensive pieces. A welcome brunch under white umbrellas. A rehearsal on the lawn where the bride cried twice and laughed 3 times. A sunset dinner where the wine flowed and the guests spoke in warm tones about love like it was something uncomplicated. Nelly smiled through it. Worked through it. Held everything together the way she always did. And through all of it, Dujin stayed. Not glued to her side. Just there. At first she told herself it was coincidence. He was the groom's friend. He was obligated. He was the kind of man who could occupy a space without needing to interact with it. Then she noticed the pattern. Whenever she stepped away from the group, toward a quieter path, a restroom corridor, a terrace, Dujin repositioned. Not blocking her. Covering her. It made her skin prickle. Not with fear. With awareness. On the 3rd day, she found him alone at the edge of the vineyard, watching workers adjust lantern strings between posts. The sun was low, painting the vines amber. A breeze lifted the hem of her dress. He didn't turn when she approached, as if he'd known she was coming before she decided to. You're still here, she said, making it light. I decided to stay, he replied. For the groom, she guessed. Dujin's gaze slid to her, slow and steady. Not only. The words landed softly and still managed to hit her like impact. She inhaled. Forced herself to keep breathing. You don't talk much, she said. I talk when it matters. That sounds like a line, she muttered. It's a fact. She should have walked away. Instead she stepped closer, drawn by the quiet gravity of him, the way being near him made the world feel less chaotic. Okay, she said, pushing. Then tell me something that matters. Dujin studied her for a moment, like he was deciding what she could handle. You're the kind of woman people try to reduce, he said. Because it makes them feel larger. Nelly's throat tightened. That's not. It is, he cut in calmly. And you keep holding yourself upright anyway. Heat rose behind her eyes, fast and irritating. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you flinched the other night, he replied. And you didn't fall. Silence stretched. The vineyard seemed to hold its breath. Nelly let out a shaky laugh that wasn't funny. Congratulations. You saw the worst 5 minutes of my life. Dujin's expression didn't change. His voice dipped lower, quieter. No, he said. I saw the part of you that survived it. Her pulse stumbled. She didn't trust her voice, so she looked away, toward the vines, the lantern light, the soft beauty that didn't know how violent the world could be. Why do you care? She asked finally. Dujin's gaze stayed on her. Because I don't like men who think they can take. That answer should have been enough. It wasn't. Do you always get involved? She asked. No. Then why me? A beat. Dujin stepped closer, not too close, not pressing, just enough that she felt the warmth of him in the cool air. His voice was low enough to feel like it belonged against her skin. Because I noticed you, he said. And once I notice something, I don't pretend I didn't. Nelly's breath caught, not from touch, not from kisses, but from the quiet, deliberate attention of a man who didn't waste words. She forced herself to look at him again. That sounds dangerous. It can be, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, If you want it to stop, say so. There it was. The choice. Clean. Real. Nelly didn't answer fast enough. Eugene's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then returned to her eyes as if he'd caught himself mid-thought. He stepped back, giving her air. Nelly exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Come, he said, as if changing the subject was a mercy. There's a private tasting in the library. She blinked. There's a library? Eugene's mouth curved faintly. There's always a library. The library was all dark wood and quiet wealth. Floor-to-ceiling shelves. A long table set with 2 glasses and a bottle that looked older than most marriages in the room outside. No sommelier. No audience. Just them. Nelly took in the setup and stared at him. Did you arrange this? Yes. Why? He poured without asking, the wine catching the lamplight like garnet. Because you're surrounded all week, he said. And you haven't had a single moment that belonged only to you. Nelly's chest tightened. I'm fine. Eugene slid a glass toward her. I didn't say you weren't. She sat. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged. Like a wire humming. She took a sip. The wine was smooth, deep, expensive in a way she couldn't name. She swallowed and tried to focus on the taste instead of the man watching her with quiet intent. It's good, she said. It should be, Eugene replied. It doesn't lie. That made her smile despite herself. Wine doesn't lie. People do, he said simply. Wine tells you exactly what it is. Nelly held his gaze. And what are you? His eyes darkened by a fraction. A problem, he said. For the wrong people. Her breath hitched. He didn't flirt. He didn't soften it. He offered her truth like a test. Nelly set the glass down carefully. You said last night you were a friend of the groom. I am. That's not all you are. Eugene didn't deny it. He leaned back slightly, posture relaxed. But his attention never moved from her face. You want details? He asked. Nelly hesitated. She thought about Julian. About fear. About what curiosity cost. No, she said finally. I want honesty. Eugene's gaze held hers, steady as a blade. Then here's honesty, he said. Whatever he was to you. It's over. Nelly's throat tightened. It's been over. No, Eugene said, voice calm. It's over in the way it should have been. Final. Something cold slid down her spine. Final meant things. She tried to keep her voice light. You don't even know him. I know enough, he said again. Then quieter, I saw where his fingers were on you. Nelly's stomach flipped. She looked down at her bandaged hand. Eugene didn't reach across the table. He didn't touch her. He just held her in that quiet focus that made everything else feel far away. If you don't want me near you, he said, say it now. Nelly's pulse beat hard in her throat. She should have said yes. She should have protected herself from the implications of a man like him. Instead she whispered, I don't want you to go. A beat. Eugene's gaze sharpened, something darker crossing his expression. Not triumph. Not hunger. Control. He stood, walked around the table, and stopped beside her chair. His hand came to rest lightly at the back of it, close enough to feel, not close enough to trap. Then I won't, he said. Nelly tilted her head back to look at him, breath shallow. What does that mean? It means, Eugene said, voice low, you finish this week in peace. She tried to swallow. Failed. And after? She asked. Eugene's eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. That depends on what you choose, he said. The answer should have felt safe. It didn't. It felt like standing at the edge of something deep. That night, back in her room, Nelly tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her phone buzzed at 1:13 a.m. Unknown number. A single message. I'm still in Napa. You can't hide. Her blood ran cold. Then before she could even type a response, another message appeared, this one from a different unknown number. Don't reply. Don't move. Look outside your door. Nelly's breath caught. She stared at the screen, pulse hammering, every instinct screaming at her to lock herself in the bathroom. Slowly, she stepped to the door and peered through the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway. Tailored black. Silent. Facing outward, like guards. Nelly's knees went weak. And in the quiet of her room, her phone buzzed one more time. This time, the name on the screen wasn't unknown. Song Do-jin. She answered with shaking fingers. Hello? His voice came through low and calm, like it always did, like the world couldn't touch him. Stay inside, he said. I'm coming to you. Nelly's heart slammed against her ribs. Is Julian here? She whispered. A pause, brief, controlled. No, Do-jin said. But he tried. And the way he said tried made the room feel suddenly terrifyingly small. Do-jin didn't come to her room. That was the first thing Nelly noticed once the adrenaline stopped rattling her bones. He stayed in the hallway, kept his distance even now, his men posted with the same quiet precision as before. No knocking. No explanations. Just containment. By morning, the vineyard was peaceful again. Too peaceful. The wedding week concluded in a blur of sunlight and vows and champagne. Nelly smiled in photographs. She danced. She toasted love with a steady hand. If anyone noticed the way security had subtly multiplied, the way unfamiliar men lingered at the edges of every gathering, no one asked. Julian didn't reappear. Do-jin never mentioned him. When it was time to leave Napa, Nelly told herself the intensity would stay behind with the vines and the lanterns. She hugged her friend, and promised to visit. By the time the car crossed back into San Francisco, Napa already felt like a controlled dream, and she sighed with the quiet relief of someone returning to routine. Normal life would put things back in proportion. It didn't. Normal life didn't put anything back in proportion. San Francisco swallowed her up the way it always did, fog, steel, schedules stacked too tightly, but the intensity followed her in quieter ways. Not as a presence she could point to. Not at first. She was 3 days back at work when she felt it. That familiar, subtle shift in the air. The sense that a room had recalibrated around someone who didn't need to announce himself. Nelly slowed outside a small cafe near her office, glass fogged from the inside, the late afternoon crowd thin and distracted. She almost kept walking. Then she looked up. Song Do-jin sat by the window, coat draped neatly over the back of his chair, coffee untouched in front of him. He wasn't watching the street. He was watching her. You, she said, stopping short. He stood immediately, not rushing, not crowding. Nelly. Her pulse ticked up despite herself. Do you live here now? Part of the time, he said. I have business in San Francisco. That answer felt real. Grounded. Not an excuse. And this, she gestured lightly between them, is coincidence? His mouth curved faintly. I hoped I'd run into you. She studied him for a beat, searching for calculation, for orchestration. She found restraint. They talked for a few minutes, nothing heavy. Work. The city. How Napa already felt distant. He didn't ask where she was going next. Didn't suggest dinner. Didn't try to extend the moment past its natural end. When they parted, it felt almost normal. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. They ran into each other again a few days later. Then again the week after that. A gallery opening. A quiet bar she liked after long days. Each time, the choice to stay and talk was hers. Only after she said yes to dinner did the world around her begin to shift. Reservations appeared, after she agreed. A car waited late one night, after she accepted the offer. Security tightened, after he asked if she'd be comfortable. The distinction mattered. He didn't insert himself into her life. He didn't touch her more than before. If anything, he touched her less. When they were together, his hands stayed deliberate, brief contact at her back through a doorway, his fingers brushing hers when he passed her a glass. Nothing that trapped. Nothing that lingered longer than she allowed. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was chosen. And it unsettled her more than force ever could. She told herself she should be relieved. She wasn't. Because the world around her started to change. It began subtly. A man standing across the street from her office for too long, pretending to check his phone. A car that followed her for 3 blocks before turning off abruptly. An unfamiliar face in her building's lobby that disappeared the moment she doubled back. Nothing happened. And that was the problem. Each time she felt the prickle of unease, it ended before it could become something worse, like a hand hovering just short of impact. When she finally confronted Jean, her voice was tight with it. "Something's wrong," she said. "I keep almost running into trouble." His answer was calm. Too calm. "Nothing reached you," he said. "That's the point." Her stomach dropped. "You knew?" "Yes." "How?" He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "You're not imagining it," he added. "You're just seeing the edges." The words landed heavy. "So what happens when it stops being the edges?" she asked quietly. Jean met her gaze, expression steady. "Then I stop it before you ever have to." And for the first time since Napa, Nelly understood what restraint really meant to a man like him. Not absence of control, but control held back, deliberately, constantly, until it was no longer optional. The city noticed him too. A West Coast power didn't move quietly into someone else's territory without consequences. Rivals tested the edges. Rumors circulated. A few names she didn't recognize stopped calling. A few familiar ones went suddenly cautious. Jean responded without spectacle. One meeting. One warning. One decisive correction. By the end of the week, the city had recalibrated around him. Nelly saw only the aftermath. Extra security. A harder line in his posture. The way his gaze tracked her surroundings with increased vigilance. Julian surfaced again, not in person, but in whispers. Lost job. Frozen accounts. Friends who stopped answering his calls. A mutual acquaintance mentioned his name once, then changed the subject too quickly. "People are talking about Julian," she said one night, not looking at him. "Are they?" "They say his job fell apart. His accounts. His father's firm." Jean didn't react. He only watched her, attentive in a way that made it impossible to tell whether he'd already anticipated the question. "Did that have anything to do with you?" she asked. He considered her for a moment. "Yes." No explanation. No warning. Just the truth, delivered like it didn't require permission. Nelly exhaled slowly. "What are you?" Jean met her gaze. "Someone who doesn't let problems linger." Nelly's stomach knotted. "Do you know how terrifying that is?" she asked, voice tight. "To realize someone can erase a life like it never mattered?" Jean's gaze was steady. "Do you know how terrifying it is to let someone who harms you keep breathing near your world?" The air went still. "If you want to walk away," he said, "you can. No pursuit. No consequence. We started dating. Nothing more." She looked at him, really looked. At the danger. The discipline. The man who had reshaped cities and still waited for her consent. Nelly exhaled. "I'm not walking away," she said. "I just needed to know who you are and what you're capable of." Jean nodded once. Acceptance, not triumph. They didn't speak again after that. The silence between them thickened, charged, until it felt like a third presence in the room. Nelly was acutely aware of her own breathing, the way it hitched when Jean stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him without being touched. He lifted his hand slowly, deliberately, waiting. She nodded once. That was all it took. His fingers slid into her hair, not tugging, not claiming, just holding her there as he kissed her again. This time it wasn't measured. It was deeper. He didn't rush, but he didn't hold back either, and the restraint she'd felt all evening shifted into something heavier, more dangerous. She felt it in her knees first. In the way her body leaned into his before she consciously decided to. In the quiet sound she made when his mouth traced along her jaw, down her throat, learned her breathing. His hands followed, firm, sure, leaving no doubt about his attention, but never crossing the line without her moving first. Every time he paused, she closed the distance. Every time she hesitated, he waited. That was the fire. The slow, devastating awareness that nothing here was accidental. That every inch he took was offered. That every reaction he drew from her only made him more controlled, not less. By the time they reached the bed, the city outside felt unreal. The world had narrowed to heat and pressure, and the way his body seemed to surround her without trapping her. She felt him tense beneath her hands, felt the effort it took for him to stay measured when everything in him was clearly straining toward more. Later, much later, she lay against him, skin warm, heart still racing, his arm heavy and secure around her waist. His thumb traced slow, absent arcs along her back, grounding, possessive without demand. The intensity hadn't faded. It had settled. Nelly pressed her face into his chest, breathing him in, aware that whatever this was between them now, it wasn't fragile. It wasn't fleeting. It was deliberate. And the knowledge of that, of how carefully he'd chosen her, of how fully she'd chosen him in return, was almost as overwhelming as the night itself. By morning, the city outside felt quieter. Not because it was safer. Because it understood the new order. And Nelly, lying beside him, understood something else entirely. She hadn't been pulled into his world. She had stepped into it, eyes open. Julian didn't lie quietly. Nelly learned that first, not from Dujin, but from the way the city started whispering his name again, strained and distorted, like a rumor people didn't want to finish out loud. He'd been seen near Dujin's territory. Too close. Too stupid. Too desperate to understand what kind of line he'd crossed. Dujin didn't tell her at first. That was how she knew something was wrong. He became sharper. More contained. His phone never left his hand. Conversations cut short the moment she entered a room. Men she didn't recognize rotated through his inner circle, faces grim, movements efficient. The air around him felt coiled. "Nelly," he said one morning, voice steady, "you're coming with me." "Where?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." That word again. She followed him anyway. The estate sat high above the coast, fortified without looking like it was. Clean lines. Open views. Security folded into the landscape like it had always been there. The moment the gates closed behind them, Nelly felt it, the shift from proximity to control. She stopped walking. "This isn't Napa," she said quietly. "No," Dujin replied. "This is where I don't make mistakes." That night, she heard the truth from someone else. Not details. Never details. Just enough. Julian had tried to force a meeting. Had shown up demanding access, shouting her name like it still belonged to him. He hadn't gotten far. He had been removed from her world completely. Nelly sat alone on the terrace long after the sun went down, the ocean black and endless below her. Her chest felt hollow, not from grief, but from the weight of understanding finally settling in. Dujin joined her without a sound. She didn't look at him. "Is he gone?" "Yes." No hesitation. No apology. She closed her eyes. "And you didn't tell me." "I removed you first," he said. "Then I handled it." She turned then, anger and fear colliding hard enough to steady her voice. "You don't get to decide what I can face." His gaze didn't waver. "I decide what reaches you." "That's not the same thing," she snapped. "No," he agreed quietly. "It's worse." The honesty knocked the breath from her. He stepped closer, not invading, not retreating. Exactly where she could see him clearly. "I don't leave my world," Dujin said. "But I don't walk away from what I choose to protect." The words were a declaration, not a threat. "And now?" she asked. "Now that I know?" He held her gaze, giving her what he hadn't before. "The choice still stands, you can walk away," he said. "Tonight. I won't follow. I won't interfere. What we had ends without consequence." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "And if I stay?" "Then you stay knowing exactly who I am," he said. "And what it costs." Silence stretched between them, deep and terrifying and honest. Nelly thought of Napa. Of the woman who'd frozen with broken glass in her hand. Of the weeks since, how she no longer checked exits first, how she slept without bracing for impact. She wasn't the same woman. "I'm not choosing you because you saved me," she said. "I'm choosing you because you see me." Dujin exhaled, slow, controlled, like he'd been holding that breath since the vineyard. He didn't touch her right away. When he did, it was careful. Deliberate. His hands framed her face like something precious, his forehead resting against hers as if grounding them both. "You are not small," he said quietly. "And you are not afraid." She wasn't. The night they spent together afterward wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow.
Intentional.
Every touch was chosen, every pause deliberate, every breath shared like an agreement quietly renewed.
Nothing was taken. Nothing rushed.
What unfolded between them was consuming without being wild, measured, deliberate, and impossible to mistake for anything temporary.
By morning, the storm had passed. Julian would not be crossing her path again. The threat ended.
The world settled into a new, colder alignment. And Nelly stood at the glass wall beside Eugene, watching the sun rise over territory she now understood.
She hadn't been claimed. She had chosen.
And nothing, not fear, not power, not the cost, would take that from her. 1 year later, the hills above Montecito glowed soft and green, the vineyard rose curving like a promise kept. Nelly walked between the vines with the ease of someone who belonged there now, wide-brimmed hat tilted back, linen dress brushing her calves, tablet tucked under her arm because she never fully stopped working. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and citrus carried in from the coast. It was quiet in a way that felt intentional. This place hadn't existed a year ago.
Now it did.
Song Eugene stood at the edge of the terrace, jacket off, sleeves rolled, watching her the way he always did, without interrupting, without claiming the moment from her. The vineyard bore a name etched discreetly into stone at the entrance.
Sovereign Reserve.
It wasn't an escape from his world. It was a sanctuary built within it.
"You're pacing," he said when she reached him.
"I'm thinking," she replied, smiling.
Which usually looks like pacing.
He accepted that without comment.
He always had.
Nelly's creative firm had expanded, cleanly, fiercely, on her terms.
Clients trusted her. Boards listened.
Stability didn't cage her ambition, it sharpened it. She chose her projects now, chose her hours, chose when to step away and when to lean in.
Protection had never meant permission to shrink.
Eugene never asked her to be less. If anything, he made room. They stood together as the sun dipped lower, his hand settling at her waist, firm, familiar, grounding.
Not possessive. Present.
The world beyond the hills still knew his name and feared it.
Deals were made. Lines were enforced.
The machinery of power kept turning.
But here with her, he was quiet.
"You were the only thing in Napa worth keeping," he said, voice low against her ear.
She huffed a laugh. "The wine will be offended."
"It tried too hard," he replied.
"You didn't."
She turned to face him, studying the man who had once frightened her with the scale of his power and then proven, day after day, that restraint was the truest measure of it.
The danger hadn't disappeared. It never would. What had changed was choice.
"Do you ever regret it?"
she asked. "Choosing me inside your world?" His answer was immediate. No. Not softened. Not romanticized. Certain.
Nelly leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath his ribs.
She hadn't traded freedom for safety. She hadn't been rescued.
She had stepped forward, eyes open, and built something rare.
A life where power bowed to consent. A partnership forged in danger and devotion. A love that never asked her to disappear.
As twilight settled over the sovereign reserve, Nelly knew, without doubt, without fear.
She hadn't been claimed. She had chosen. And he had chosen her right back.